have a look at the original design for the female Adam. And I say it like that on purpose because when God created humanity, he created male and female. It tells us that in Genesis chapter 1. And if you listen to me preaching any length of time, you will realize that I come back to this passage often because the original creation is the plan that God has for us now. It is our commission. It was reiterated to Noah and it was reiterated to us through Jesus. And that is that we would have dominion, be fruitful and multiply. In verse 27 of Genesis chapter 1, it said that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So it tells us that right at the beginning that he created male and female, and they were both named Adam. The word Adam means humankind. So it kind of makes more sense when you understand that Adam means humankind. And then we get over into chapter 2, and there's a little bit more detail about the creation of the male and the female. And there's information we can go into how we created the woman, what he did. And the normal narrative is that she was taken from the rib of a man. But I will leave you a little clue. It's not quite exactly what happened, but we haven't got time to go into that today. So when this woman was brought to the man said, "This is the last bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She will be called woman because she's taken out of a man." And then the marriage institute happens in verse 24 of chapter 2. "A man will leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. The man and his wife were both naked and not ashamed." So picture this. You have this humankind, Adam, male and female. It's split into two, male and female. And then through the marriage act, it comes back into one. When you get married, you become one flesh. And we struggle in our Western thinking, our modern thinking, to actually understand what that means to be one flesh, because we're two separate individuals. But more on that perhaps if we have time later on. So God said that it wasn't good that man was alone. And he said, this is verse 18 of chapter 2. It's not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. And you might have some translations in your Bible where it says helpmate or helper, helpmate or helpmeet. So he's saying, I will make a helper that's suitable for him. And those words, helpmeet or helpmate, are not the original Hebrew words. They were words that came around in the 17th and the 18th century in England. And there was a biblical scholar at that time, and his definition, or what he put out into the churchianity world at that time, was that a helpmate the purpose was to make man comfortable, to dress his food, which was an old-fashioned way of saying prepare his meals, be pleasing, look good, and in all respects, to be entirely answerable to all the man's wants and wishes. So that was the 18th century English definition of that word. But we have to look back at what the actual biblical definition of that word is. Because unfortunately, as we sit here in 2025, we have lots of things within our understanding that have not come from the biblical definition of words. So the word here that's translated helpmeet or helpmate comes from the Hebrew word Ezer Kenegdo. I'll spell that for you. So Ezer is Ezer, and Kenegdo is Kenegdo. You can decide.
You can repeat it.
Okay, so Ezer, Ezer, Kenegdo, Kenegdo. So you can make up your own minds how you want to pronounce the second one of those two words, because it is a little challenging. But what that means is it means a suitable helper, a counterpart, not a subordinate, which may not be something that you've heard previously. The word Ezer signifies a strong helper, a rescuer, or a power. And then Kenegdo, it means corresponding to or opposite, implying a complementary, powerful partner rather than a weak assistant. Someone that fits perfectly with the man and stands alongside him, but yet is a distinct entity. And the word Ezer has the connotation of strength, rescue, and deliverance. And interesting, we find that word Ezer used, it's 21 times you can find that word Ezer in the Bible, and 16 of those times it refers to God being the helper of Israel. If you've got your Bibles, turn over to Psalms 121. And I'm sure you're familiar with this psalm. It's a well-known psalm. I lift my eyes up to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. So the Hebrew words there for the English word help is this word Ezer. So if we read that again and put the Hebrew word in, I lift my eyes to the hills. From where does my Ezer come? My Ezer comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And then over in Psalm 124 in verse 8, it says, our Ezer is the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. So there is, as I said, 16 different uses of that word Ezer in the Hebrew Bible, and they all refer to its being God's help for Israel. So it's a very powerful word. Now, if God had used the word Ezer when he described this woman he was going to create, then that would have put the woman at a higher place than a man. But he added onto it this word Kenegdo, which means that they're equal and opposite. And it's it's like the woman will complement the man's strengths and the man will complement the woman's strengths. So that may be a different interpretation of how you've read that word when God said, I will make a helpmeet or a helper suitable for him. It's not a subservient or a subordinate or a meek role. It's one that stands in strength alongside the man. So let's have a look at the role of women I'm going to look at the role of women in Britain around the 50s and 60s, which was the time when my mother was a young girl, and I'm born in 1960, so she already had one child. I was her second child. So this was the world that she lived in at that time. Now, women had rights on paper, but legal rights, that is, but in reality, there was very tight restrictions around what they could and couldn't do. And as soon as a woman got married in Britain in the 1950s and 60s, she lost her independence completely. She was expected to prioritize family over herself, and she needed a man's approval to do many adult decisions. She was expected to focus on marriage and children and the home. And it was the cultural norm that the woman's place was in the home. She was not treated as an equal, and married women were expected to leave their paid employment when she got married And definitely, if they became pregnant, they could not work outside the house. There was very limits on the career progressions that she could take, especially if she got married. That was the end of her working outside the house. And she needed a husband's consent and approval for many things, like she couldn't open a bank account, for example. And the church of the day reinforced those traditional gender roles. So that was what, and it was really into probably the 80s when I was a young girl that it started to change. So that was England back in those days. Now I've done some research on Kenya, so you can tell me if I've got this, if this is how you understand it as well. So the same time period in Kenya, the woman's status was not defined by one system, but it was overlapped with many overlapping authorities, for example, tribal and colonial, because there was obviously the Brits were around in Kenya at that time. The church and family clan structures all influenced where a woman stood within society. There was often fewer protections for a woman and less autonomy than the women in the UK at that time. Marriage defined a woman's identity, and it was often arranged and linked to a bride price. The married woman was under her husband's authority and his family's authority. Polygamy was common, and widows often faced the loss of the land that they'd been working on, and that was often then inherited by a male relative, and economic insecurity happened to that widow. The Kenyan women, you can tell me if this is true, apparently worked harder than many men. And they farmed, raised children, collected water and firewood, managed food production, and sold goods in the local market. All those kind of activities, they weren't allowed to do that in England in similar time period. But the money flowed through the man. And they were defined by the marriage and motherhood and lived under layers of authority and the husband's clan and the church and colonial systems. So in both countries, UK and Kenya, there was strong formal participation rights, but this is now, I've moved on to now. In UK, there are strong rights that a woman have, and a lot of those things I mentioned earlier are no longer, but there's still gaps on pay and leadership and the church leadership within the church. In Kenya, I believe there's broader participation now, but women still face barriers in access to things like capital, securing employment, and economic autonomy. So you can discuss later whether you think that is true from that research that I've done. I certainly know and know that from as I was growing and working, and I was well-paid, I was an accountant, so I still am an accountant. I had a good, respectable job. But they were challenges as I was in my working career from the male patriarchal structure that was in England at the time. So let's go back to the church. And let's go back to the environment that Paul was preaching into when we've got the early church and what Jesus was doing in those cultures at the time. Because really what Jesus did and what Jesus demonstrated about women is the role that we as men and we as women should be modeling in our cultures. It's tricky because we've all got cultural norms and cultural things that are still going on in our lives. So Jewish women in the early church, they lived under the Torah, and that was interpreted through the rabbis and the teachings that they had. They were legally under the authority of their father. That became their husband, and sometimes their son took over that authority. So remember when Jesus was on the cross, his mother Mary was a widow at that time. And Jesus was probably looking after his mother under this structure. And he turned around and said to John, his disciple, "Behold your mother." And he said to Mary, "Behold your son." So he was taking care of his mother in that situation and within the structure of the Jewish way of life. A woman could not initiate a divorce, but the husbands could divorce their wives for very trivial reasons. A woman's testimony was not considered worthy to stand up in court, and she was excluded from all formal religious education. She was not counted as a quorum when anything was going on in the synagogue, and as far as religion was concerned, she could observe, but she couldn't participate. Torah, or study in the scriptures, was for men, and she worshipped in the court of the women. And all the spiritual authority at that time through the Jewish culture was held by males. And although the Jewish woman had dignity within her household, there was very little public, legal, or spiritual authority that she held within the community. So this is the way it was for women when Jesus and Paul and the others were presenting the gospel. So we move on to Paul a little bit, and he had like Jewish women, Greek women, and Roman women. So what was it like for the Greek women in their culture? So the respectable women in the Greek culture lived largely secluded from interacting with commoners. Public life for their culture belonged to the men, and women were expected to remain unseen. They were expected to be silent in public, and their focus was on their household management. They were legally minors for the whole of their life, so they never passed through into adulthood to make those adult decisions. But they could participate in the pagan rituals. Often you saw priestesses within the pagan rituals that they worshipped. But that did not translate to any equality within social structure. Men had sexual freedom. Women were expected to be virgins and chaste. And under adultery laws, the women were punished much more harshly. So the Greek women were more religiously visible, but they were still socially controlled and valued for their purity and silence. So what about the Roman women? Because remember, Paul in his ministering into the Corinthian church and into all the Gentile churches, he's got all these three cultures within that congregation. So the Roman women had more legal freedom. They could own property and inherit wealth and run businesses. But the social power within the structure of the Roman culture was still rested with men. Politically and publicly, authority was male only. The Roman women were expected to be modest and pure and produce heirs. Motherhood was a civic virtue. They had more economic and legal freedoms, but no moral or spiritual equality. So what did Paul tell us? What does Paul tell us about the Christian women and what Jesus did when he came onto the earth and initiated the new covenant? So in the early church, women and men were baptized equally. They received the Holy Spirit equally, prophesied, prayed, and hosted churches equally. Women were called sisters, co-workers, and fellow heirs. And they directly contradicted the Jewish, the Greek, and the Roman assumptions about women. See, a Jewish man would wake up every morning and he would pray, "Thank God that I wasn't born a woman." So if you were the wife of a Jewish man, you wake up in the morning next to your husband and he's praying and thanking God that he's not been born a woman. Jesus taught women openly. You remember when Mary sat at Jesus' feet and Jesus said to her sister Martha, Martha's busying herself, come into the kitchen and help me prepare the food. And Jesus says she has chosen the best thing. He taught women openly and he allowed women to sit as his disciples. He included them in his traveling ministry and he appeared first to women after the resurrection. And that was shocking in the Jewish culture. So in the early church, women hosted churches, they taught alongside men, they were recognized as apostles, and they prophesied publicly. So what happened then to where we are now and the society that I started to describe at the beginning? So as the church started to formalize through the second and fourth centuries, the woman's authority started to narrow again, and the church absorbed the Roman patriarchy, the culture of the Roman world, and the gospel freedom was institutionalized. And later, church tradition re-imported the cultural hierarchy that had been within the Roman world. And by the 4th century, Augustine, who was one of the early church fathers, had framed that the male authority was the natural order. And then we have a number of councils that are happening in that time period. You will have heard of Council of Nicaea and Constantine Council. They prohibited women from approaching the altar, from teaching publicly, and holding any office. And they rebranded all this as orthodoxy. So within 400 years from the freedom that Jesus and Paul had given women, the structure of the church starts to put it all back as it was in the cultures of those days. So in the midst of all that, as new covenant men and women of God, how do we navigate our own cultures, the cultural structures within our churches, and the structure of our family unit, and I'm assuming you're wanting to mirror what Jesus taught about the place and role of men and women. So what do you do, or how do you love your wife? Now, Paul has some really interesting conversations, and I'm looking at my time because Peter did say leave some time for questions, but he talks we'll just look at Ephesians because of time, and Ephesians chapter 5 verse 22, where it's Ephesians chapter 5 verse 22. Wives, submit to your own. Ephesians chapter 5 verse 22. Okay? Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the head of the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and himself its Saviour. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendour, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Verse 28. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. Because we are members of his body, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Does some of that sound familiar with what we read earlier? Genesis chapter 2. We read it earlier. Verse 24. A man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So Paul is writing into the culture that has those three, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Jewish people within this church. And they've all got all this cultural baggage of how women sit in society. And Paul is writing into that, and he's saying, love your wives in the same way that Christ loves the church. So how does Christ love the church? How does he love the church? I think I'm actually quite glad I'm not a man, because I think loving another human in the same way that Christ loves the church is a really high standard to live up to. It's sacrificial. It's not self-focused. It's intentional, not assumed. It's protective and safe. And it's understanding, not dismissive. And it leads through example, not control. I would say that that's how Christ loves us, isn't it? He doesn't control us. He is sacrificial in his love for us. He intentionally loves us. He protects us and makes us safe. And he understands us and listens to us. And he leads us through example and not just control of telling us what to do. So how do you love your wife? When you make a woman feel safe and secure, you will turn your home into a haven, because a woman needs to feel safe and secure. She doesn't need you to be perfect, but she needs you to be present and humble and commit to loving her as Christ loves, with patience. She needs to feel safe and belonging and be seen and known, and that rest settles her nervous system. When she feels safe, and her contribution is valued, you are going to get like a superstar woman. One of the things that you can do is figure out what makes her feel safe and secure. Now, every one of us responds to love in a different way, and they call it love languages. So some people respond to words of affirmation or encouragement, or just talking to, saying, you're doing a great job. But it has to be secure and sincere, rather. Some of us respond to quality time, spending time, just talking and just spending time together. Some respond, and this is not just man to women, this is through friendships and in ministry and what have you. Some respond through acts of service. Some respond through receiving gifts, and it doesn't have to be expensive gifts. It can be just pick some wildflowers. I don't know if you have wildflowers in Kenya. I can't remember seeing any wildflowers. Some respond to physical touch, and it doesn't mean intimacy. It's just like a hug or holding hands or just a pat on the shoulder. So you need to find out which of these your wife responds to. And the best way to do that is to actually ask her. Like for me, physical touch. The way that my husband shows me he loves me, he will come and put his hands on my shoulders when I'm washing the dishes maybe, or he will just hug me, or yeah, just some in some way of touching that is not doesn't lead into the bedroom, but it's just a comfort. It's I respond to that. I also respond to words of affirmation, like encouraging words, that he's proud of me, that he loves me, that just those, and those are not expensive things to do. They're simple things. When a woman is a incubator of what you give her and the environment that she lives in. So if you give a woman some ingredients, some food, she will make you a meal. If you give a woman a home, a house, she will create a home. If you give woman sperm, she will create a child. If you give woman grief, she will incubate it and give that back to you. So whatever you give to the woman that's your wife, she is going to incubate that and give it back to you. So the feeling of safety and security is really important. If she feels that she is not safe and she's not secure, she will start looking for ways to make that herself safe and secure, especially if there's children involved. So I think I've been talking now for 30 minutes, so I think I will finish there. There is lots of, when I come in April, I want to go through all those difficult passages and of what Paul talks about women and just unpick them a little bit. But for today, I think that is enough. So we looked at what it was like for a woman in England in the 50s and 60s, what it was like for a woman in Kenya, what it's like at present day. We looked at the meaning of that word helpmate, and then we looked at what it was like in the early church culture for Jewish, Greek, and Roman women, and what Paul and Jesus taught that the structure for women should be. So I'm sure there's lots of questions, and I gave you just a little bit to finish off with on suggestions of how you can love your wife. But at the end of the day, the main thing I think from this whole talk is that man and woman together are one, and they walk in side by side in partnership with each other to actually advance the kingdom. Now that doesn't mean that the man has to do all the cooking and look after the children and wash the dishes and clean the clothes, because we take the strengths and skills that each one of us have to bring it to the partnership. So I'm going to finish there and open up for any questions that you might have.